Greetings and welcome to Paraclete Academy's Modern Biology course. This PowerPoint is a Chapter 1, Section 1 lecture that is required for the week of August 19th, 2019. Paraclete Academy, Pro Gloria Dei et Nostra Bona, for the glory of God and our own good. Let's go ahead and get started. So first, we'll start with the Chapter 1, Section 1 course lecture outline. An outline is designed to provide you with an expectation of what will specifically be covered within this lecture. First, we're going to talk about biology and you. And the second section will be the characteristics of life, as covered in the Section 1, Chapter 1. Let's go ahead and get started. So, starting off with biology and you, let's find out what biology is and what good is it? Why do we need it? What purpose does it serve? So biology is a Greek word. It's a compound word, that is to say two words combined into one with Greek word roots. Bios meaning life and ology meaning study or the study of. So biology is defined as the study of life. People that are practitioners of the study of life or biology are called biologists. And biologists study a wide range of areas and seek answers to questions about the natural world. Some of the things that biologists study are how living things work, how those things interact with the environment, how they change over time. Now, biologists study the many different types of living things as well. So things as small as bacteria, which would be represented by this moldy loaf of bread. We can see all the mold and different bacteria that are multiplying and growing or reproducing. We'll discuss that later in this lecture. And they also study large animals such as this Bengal tiger and everything in between. Biologists investigate subjects that affect the way you live. One example would be which foods are healthy. Another example would be how much exercise should a person get. Biologists study that as well. The next thing would be how to avoid getting sick. Biologists also actively work to solve real-world problems. An example of a few real-world problems would be improving the food supply of a given area, curing diseases, and we can see that we see a biologist working or a scientist working within a laboratory, and then, of course, preserving our environment. It's very important that as image bearers of God, that we don't worship the creation, but we are stewards of it and are supposed to protect it and take care of it. So, as far as this biology and you section, the big idea here, Peter, is that studying biology helps us make informed decisions on issues that affect us and society. So let's go ahead and let's move to the second section of the second area, of this lecture, which covers the characteristics of life. Of all the objects that exist in our world, there are three basic types. There are living objects, such as the cute little feet of this baby here. There are objects that were once living, as represented by this mummy from ancient Egypt. And we can see his feet. And then non-living things, which would be represented by this statue. Notice that all three bear the same likeness, right? So the baby is a living being, has feet. The mummy was once a living being, but is now dead, and the body has been preserved, and we can see it there. And then, of course, we see a statue that is formed in the image of a human, that even though it has feet like the other two, is not living at all. So here's the question. How can we tell the difference between these? Now, they both had 2 feet. Each foot had 5 toes, and they looked pretty similar to one another. So how can we tell the difference between a living thing, a thing that was once living but is no longer living, and a non-living object? Well, the answer to this question is that biologists have established that living things share 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Biologists have established that living things share 7 characteristics of life. Now, what are these? We're about to head on here and go over them right now. So what are the 7 characteristics of life? The first one, and these are not necessarily in a particular order, I've just numbered them. There is organization and the presence of 1 or more cells. Living things respond to stimuli. Living things seek or have homeostasis. Living things have a metabolism. Living things have growth and development. Living things reproduce. And living things change through time. So let's go through each one of these. Organization and the presence of 1 or more cells. So what is organization? Or from a biological context, what does the word organization refer to? Well, organization is the high degree of order within an organism's internal and external parts and in its interactions with the living world. Well, what is a cell? So a cell is the smallest unit that can perform all life's processes. We'll go more into details. We learn about those in future presentations, future lectures, and future chapters. So there are 2 basic types of cells. There is the unicellular organism, which is an organism made up of 1 cell. And then there are the multicellular organisms, which are organisms that are made up of multiple cells. Sorry about that. One of our multicellular organisms, our beautiful daughter Evangeline, seems to be having a little difficulty right now. But let's go ahead and let's get back to the lecture. So continuing with the characteristics of life, we see, well, let's review the organizational hierarchy, or the organization hierarchy of an organism. So at the top level of the organization hierarchy, we have an organism. Now, an organism is made up of organ systems, okay, which are groups of specialized parts that carry out a certain function in the organism. For example, we'll take this brown barn owl. So this is a complex, organized organism that has multiple organ systems, each of which do and are designed to carry out certain things. For example, we can take a look here, and we can see that in this area right here is the barn owl's ear. That would be an organ, and we'll continue forward. The next level would be, the next level down from the hierarchy would be organs. So organs are defined as structures that carry out specialized jobs within an organ system. For an example, an ear would be an organ. So here we have the ear of the barn owl, and this is an organ, and it serves a specific purpose of allowing the owl to be able to hear sound. Now, if we go further down, we can look and see that the next level within the organization hierarchy would be tissue. So tissue is defined, tissue is defined as groups of cells that have similar abilities and that allow the organ to function. So, for an example, there's nervous tissue within the ear that allows the ear to detect sound. So within the organ that is the ear, there is tissue, nervous tissue, that allows that ear to detect sound. Tissues are made up of cells. Now, in order for something to be a cell must have the following properties or traits. A cell must be covered by a membrane or a covering, contain all genetic information necessary for replication, be able to carry out all cell functions. And we'll look at the picture here, and we'll see that within the ear, we have these nervous tissue that are here, okay? We have this nervous tissue which allows the ear to detect sound. So now let's just take this small little area and we're going to zoom in and magnify this little area and see what's in it, okay? Continuing to drill down or to look further, we see that we see that tissues contain organelles, okay? So each cell, tissues contain cells, but cells, contain organelles. Now, an organelle is defined as a tiny structure that carries out functions necessary for the cell to stay alive, okay? So for an example, drilling down into that tissue, we see that that tissue actually contains an organelle. This is a mitochondrion. We'll learn that when we start to actually study cells themselves. We'll learn more about the purpose of a mitochondria. But we can see that that tissue contains an organelle. In this particular case, a mitochondrion. And if we see, this is the mitochondrion, or the organelle, right? So we see if we drill down into a part of that organelle, we also begin to see that the next level of organizational hierarchy, as we go further down and down and down, we see are biological molecules. So organelles contain biological molecules. Biological molecules are the chemical compounds that provide physical structure. Biological molecules are chemical compounds that bring about movement, and biological molecules are the chemical compounds that bring about energy use and bring about other cellular functions. So we'll go ahead and we'll open up, and we see within that mitochondrion, within that organelle, we have what are called biological molecules. So this would be the biological molecule. But if we look at a specific biological molecule and we drill down even further into God's creation in the way that He most skillfully, powerfully, and wisely determined and created, we can look here and see that that biological molecules actually contain atoms. So the lowest level within the organizational hierarchy would be atoms. So all biological molecules contain atoms. Atoms are the simplest particle of an element that retains all the properties of a certain element. Okay, I'll say that again. Atoms are the simplest particle of an element that retains all the properties of a certain element. So we can see here that if we look at that biological molecule, we see that it is made up of an atom. And this particular atom here is oxygen. Okay, so let's go ahead and continue. The second characteristic of life is response to stimuli. So organisms can respond to a stimulus. Stimulus is a particular, and we'll go over that, a physical or chemical change in the internal or external environment. Okay. For an example, when it gets hot, our body heats up and we sweat. That would be a reaction to the stimulus of heat. The body seeks to cool itself, so as it gets hot, it produces sweat that then goes on the skin, and then we're air cooled from the sweat. So, and that's just as an example. So, organisms can respond to a stimulus. A stimulus is defined as a physical or a chemical change in the internal or the inside environment or the external environment, the outside. The plural of stimulus would be stimuli. Now, it's very important to note that organisms must be able to respond and react to changes in their environment in order to stay alive. Using the sweating thing for an example, if we didn't sweat, the body would not have that primary way of being able to cool itself off under extreme temperatures of heat, whether we're working out or whether it's a summer day or we're out playing, any of those different things. If the body did not have a way to react to heat, whether internally or externally, and to cool itself off, then we would certainly be in trouble, wouldn't be able to live. So let's go ahead and continue. So organisms must be able, living organisms, right, must be able to respond and react to changes in their environment to stay alive. Okay? So now let's talk about homeostasis. Okay? Homeostasis, all living things have mechanisms that allow them to maintain stable internal conditions without which these organisms can die. So we see here, for an example, let's take the sweating thing again. So the body does well within a certain given temperature range. If we go too far toward heat, well, we could die of extreme heat. If we go too far to the cold, well, we could also die of hypothermia. So in between is this area that is optimal for life and for the functions of life that is called homeostasis. For an example, when the body sweats, when internal or external heat is experienced, and the body experiences that, it produces sweat to cool the body off. Now, if we didn't have that function, as we just discussed before, the body would overheat, there would be damage to the body, possibly death, right? Well, if there was no such thing as sweating, there definitely would be death, okay? So the body produces sweat to cool down the body and bring it back to a manageable temperature, which would be the body's attempt to bring things back to that state of homeostasis. So what's interesting here, we can see that all of these characteristics of life are actually interconnected. So the characteristics of life, or an organism showing the properties of these characteristics of life, they have all of them. It's not just one or two of them. They have all of them, and all of them are not interchangeable, but they're all connected. So that when the body experiences that stimuli, right, when it experiences the stimuli of heat, for an example, the body produces sweat in order to cool itself off, bring a temperature back to a manageable middle temperature, that middle range that's called homeostasis, that produces the optimal environment for life. Okay, to continue, right? So responding to stimulus, homeostasis. Okay, I think that we've discussed that enough. So let's go ahead and continue. Homeostasis, the definition of homeostasis, is the maintenance of a stable level of internal conditions, even though environmental conditions are constantly changing. So, once again, with the sweating, if it gets too hot, the body produce a sweat in order to bring the body back to that stable level of internal conditions, the right range of temperatures. If it gets too cold, the body starts to shiver. You know, if you've been out on a really cold day and you get cold and you get a shiver, your muscles are creating friction in order to increase the temperature or the heat level within the body. So if it gets too cold, the body works to make it warmer. If it gets too hot, the body works to cool it down. And that's a perfect example of, one, the body being able to respond to stimuli of heat or cold, for an example, and the body's efforts in responding to that stimuli to bring it back to that stable level of internal conditions. That is to say, in this context, a right or a good temperature for it. Okay, so let's continue. Metabolism. Okay, so this is the characteristic number 4, metabolism. Okay, living organisms use energy to power all the life processes. For an example, so we all need energy to continue life, right? So one example would be repair. Okay, so like when you work out, when you lift weights, or when you're running and playing and doing the things that you do, and you bump your knee, or you skin your elbow, or things like that, your body needs a source of energy. Living things need a source of energy to one of life's processes is to repair itself. The second life process, would be movement. We move around, and if we didn't have energy to do that, well, we wouldn't be able to move. Another thing would be growth. In order for the organism to grow, energy is required. And then, of course, energy use depends on metabolism. So the life processes of repair, movement, growth, they all require energy use and growth. And then energy use itself requires metabolism. Okay? So the definition of metabolism here is the sum of all the chemical reactions that take in and transform energy and materials from the environment. Okay? So we see that plants, for an example, there are some organisms that are able to create their own energy source. So plants, algae, and some bacteria, for an example, use the sun's energy to generate sugar molecules during a process called photosynthesis. And in that, they create their own energy source from the sun. Now, there are other organisms that depend on other organisms as a food source for fuel and energy. We as human beings are one of those. We require food as our energy source. So we require other things. We're not able to make it on our own. We eat food, external sources of energy. We eat those, digest them, and that's how we get our energy. Okay? So, characteristic of life number 5, growth and development. Okay? So, growth and development. Let's talk about that. All living things, another characteristic of life, all living things grow and increase in size. Okay? Now, non-living things, like rocks and crystals, for an example, they grow by accumulating more of the same material of which they are made. Okay, now, living things grow from the division and enlargement of cells. Okay, so that's interesting. So rocks, crystals, they grow by just accumulating more and more and more of it, of the same materials. That's not how we, as living organisms, that's not how we grow and develop. Okay? So living things grow from the division and enlargement of cells. Okay? So cell division is defined as the formation of 2 new cells from an existing cell. Okay? So division, of course, not unlike math, is where we're dividing things, we're separating things, right? So you could have one cell that splits or forms into 2 new cells from the one existing cell. That would be called cell division. And then development is the process by which an organism becomes a mature adult. So maturity is within the plan and process of God and His creation. Okay? So, cell division and cell development involves cell division and cell differentiation. Let's talk about that for a moment. So, for an example, the human body is composed of trillions of specialized cells, all of which originated from a single cell, the fertilized egg. Okay? So, let's talk about reproduction. Okay? So, living things reproduce. All organisms produce new organisms like themselves in a process called reproduction. Okay, so reproduction would be the process that of all organisms producing new organisms like themselves. Okay, so this characteristic is not essential to the survival of an individual organism. So, for an example, so what does that mean? Well, I'll read it again. This characteristic, reproduction, this characteristic of life is not essential to the survival of an individual organism. So it's not necessary for me as an individual to reproduce myself in order to live. Okay, and there's a lot of reasons why that's not true, or why that's true, but that's what that's saying. So in order for me to continue living, it's not necessary for me as an individual to reproduce another Timothy Lampley. Okay, I don't need to make another clone or make another one of myself in order to continue living. Okay, and that's actually an important fact, but we'll go over that in a different context at a different point. So note, reproduction is essential for the continuation of the species. So while reproduction is not necessary for the survival of an individual organism, that's true, it's equally true that reproduction is essential for the continuation of the human species. So for an example, in order for my family line, if you will, to continue, I would need to reproduce with my wife and to have children or offspring to reproduce. I would need to do that in order for my family line to continue, but humans as a species would need to do that period in order for them to continue, because if we all stopped reproducing, the human race or species would no longer be. It would go into non-existence. Okay? So let's go ahead and continue. So we're going to continue with reproduction. So during reproduction, organisms transmit hereditary information to their offspring. So there are certain characteristics, there are certain hereditary traits that each organism possesses. And during the process of reproduction, those traits, whether being tall or hair color, eye color, skin color, there are different hereditary traits that we organisms pass on to our offspring. Okay? So hereditary information is encoded in a large molecule called deoxyribonucleic acid, otherwise known as DNA, otherwise known as the blueprint for who we are. Okay? A short segment of DNA contains the instructions for a single trait of an organism called a gene. Okay? So that is an example right here of a DNA, of the DNA ladder, right? Okay? Or a segment, if you will, of a DNA. All right? So, now hereditary information is transferred to offspring by one of two ways. So there are two ways in which our hereditary information is transferred or we reproduce. Okay? The first way is sexual reproduction. Okay? So hereditary information recombines from two organisms of the same species. So that is to say, for example, myself as a living organism, male, and my wife, as a female organism, living organism, we come together through the sexual act. Since this is sexual reproduction, we are two different organisms, but we're of the same species, and we come together, we combine our DNA, if you will. We come together in that sexual act, and in that sexual act, we combine our hereditary information so that when conception happens, when my seed, which is the sperm, and my wife's egg, okay, when those combine, those both contain our genetic information. When those combine and there's conception and a living being is made, that is a baby. It's called a zygote, but it's a baby. It's a living being. The offspring is similar to both of us. It's got some of my traits, just like you, Peter. You have some of my traits, and then you have some of Mom's traits, but you're not a carbon copy of us. God uses both genetic or hereditary libraries from me and from your mom, couples them together, and comes up with a unique creation or human being from these two libraries. Okay, let's continue. So here we see a picture of a baby growing in a mommy's womb. Okay. So the other way hereditary information is transferred to offspring would be asexual reproduction. So A means without, okay? So without sexual reproduction. Or it's reproduction without sex, okay? So a great example here is hereditary information from different organisms is not combined, okay? So in this one, and I can't use us as an example because we're sexual beings, but an asexual example would be this orange here, for an example. So there are microorganisms that are multiplying. So original and new organisms are genetically the exact same. So they're carbon copies. So the mold, the bacteria that's on this orange, that is creating mold, is multiplying more exact copies of the same organism. And now there's such a huge multiplication of them here that you can start to see it here. It starts off small, but it multiplies and gets larger, 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 larger until it becomes visible. Microorganisms, by the way. Okay, so micro being small. So the bacterium. So bacterium is an excellent example, which is why I picked this image. It's a bacterium that splits into two identical cells and continues to multiply with their exact carbon copies. That's what asexual reproduction will do, passing on its hereditary information, but it's exact. The information is not combined; it's just multiplied, and they're carbon copies. So that's the difference between sexual reproduction and asexual reproduction. Sexual reproduction, you have two organisms that have hereditary traits that come together, combine that information, and then even though that information is combined, it's not an exact carbon copy. You have a new organism as a product of the two parents. You have a new child organism as the product of the two parent organisms that have a combination of that hereditary information, but yet is its own individual organism. Okay. With asexual reproduction, hereditary information is transferred to offspring, but it's the same. The information is not combined; it's just merely multiplied. They're genetically the same. You get the exact same carbon copy of the organism. Okay. I hope that was helpful to you. Let's continue. So the last characteristic of life, number 7, is change through time. So individual organisms experience many changes during their lifetime. Basic genetic characteristics do not change. population of living organisms evolve or change through time. This concept of the word evolution is not antithetical to Christianity. Okay, in this case, it means change, and it is that. For an example, like it says here, individual organisms experience many changes during their lifetime. Basic genetic characteristics do not change. For an example, myself, I don't quit being a human male. Okay, I don't quit being a human male, even though I'm almost 50 years, and there are some changes. I've got gray hair. There's things that maybe not as strong as I used to be, maybe not as quick as I used to be, those types of different things. But I don't stop being, so there are different qualities or traits as far as like, memory or, different types of things, my hair color, as I'm getting older, wrinkles, those types of things. So those changes I do experience, but I don't stop being a human male. Those genetic characteristics will not change, okay? And then, of course, the population of living organisms evolve or change through time. As we continue living and we go along this lifespan, we, from birth to death, we do change, okay? So here is a picture that brings that, to light here. So first, we have this caterpillar, and this caterpillar goes into a cocoon, and inside the cocoon there are changes that happen to this caterpillar to where eventually the caterpillar changes into this butterfly. Okay, so this is its life cycle or its development cycle. Okay, and then this would be a mature adult, and it continues until it dies. Okay, so that is our chapter section. Okay, that is our Chapter 1, Section 1 lecture. Thank you for watching. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to me, certainly in person, via text, or through Canvas email. You can certainly reach out to me via Canvas email. So the assignments for you to watch this, you should be taking notes on the information, the big ideas and the big points, the vocabularies. You should be taking notes on that, okay? Have a good one. Bye.